Good morning, everyone. We are going to give you a very quick overview of the Second World War. There's a worksheet which goes with this movie. Fill in the kernbegrip, the key events with the key years, and there are also some source questions to kind of keep you active as we're going. All right, we're going to start in 1935 and 1936. Hitler is getting more confident. He starts to break the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. He starts increasing the size of the German army and the German navy, and importantly, he sends troops into the Ruhrgebiet, the industrial area that had been occupied by France. Now, this was against the Treaty of Versailles. The French had a bigger army than him at that time, but the French did nothing. Hitler got away with it. Then, if you remember one of Hitler's big ideas, Heim ins Reich, your own nationality in your own country. Now, there were big German populations in Austria, and also in a part of Czechoslovakia, Czechia as you call it, called the Sudetenland. Hitler then occupied these areas, took them over, and made them part of a greater Germany. Again, Britain, France, the other powers did nothing. In fact, they did more than nothing. The British Prime Minister went to Germany. Hitler said to him, obviously, this is all I'm going to do. We just want Germans in Germany. We want a slightly bigger army. I'm not going to go any further. I'm not going to evade anything. Chamberlain said, okay, I believe you, cool, whatever. And Hitler was allowed to get away with this. So the big question is, why was Hitler able, before the Second World War, when he could have been stopped, to build up his army, take over these other countries, break the terms of the Treaty of Versailles? If you have a look at this cartoon here, called Stepping Stones to Glory, you can see the spineless leaders of democracy underneath Hitler's boots. What's the message of the cartoon? Pause the video, write your answer. So, the message of the cartoon basically is that no one wanted to stand up to Hitler. You can see the leaders of France and Germany, the democratic nations, are not doing anything. Hitler's just able to walk over them in order to become, as he wants to say, you can see boss of the universe, which is in the top left corner. Now, why did this happen? Well, the people in the Western democracies, Britain and France, were worried about what had happened before. They were desperate to avoid another war. The First World War had been so terrible, they didn't want another, and they were willing to do anything rather than contemplate sending millions of people to die again. The other big problem is a lot of these countries themselves had forgotten to actually build up their own armed forces. They looked at a big, powerful Germany and they realized at this point they couldn't stand up to them, so they decided instead to let Hitler do what he wanted. Hitler went a little bit further in his I'm going to do whatever I like thing and signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin. Stalin, remember, a communist. Hitler was a Nazi. He hated communists. He and Stalin signed a Verdrag, a treaty together, which said that we will not fight each other, because Hitler, of course, wanted to do more. But if Russia was going to stop him, that was going to be a problem for him. So the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Hitler and Stalin agreed to divide up Poland and Germany, because Stalin has agreed not to attack him, is able to start his conquest. He invades Poland. They use an excuse of a apparent Polish attack on a radio station, which the Germans themselves had done, and they invade. Got some more cartoons here. Have a look at these. Can you tell me what the message of these cartoons are? Again, press stop. Do your answers. So if anyone looks at them, obviously the cartoonist understands that Hitler and Stalin are not natural friends. In fact, they're natural enemies. As Hitler says over the body, which you can see there, which is meant to be Poland, he calls Stalin the scum of the earth. Stalin calls Hitler the bloody assassin of the workers. Both of these things are true. People realized that this agreement between Hitler and Stalin was just so these dictators could get what they wanted in the short term, but everyone predicted that they would come to blows and start fighting later. So this is then the start of World War II. After Hitler had attacked Poland, the spineless leaders of Britain and France really had no choice but to declare war. However, in the first few months of the war, the fighting is mainly taking in Poland, and it was terrible, terrible fighting. The Germans and the Russians conquered, divided up Poland, and were starting a huge campaign of mass killings there. But Britain and France did not declare, although they had declared war, were not fighting. They were kind of sitting and waiting. This was called the phony war. So the question, do you think, why didn't the British and the French attack sooner? Again, pause. So main reason is, one, they were unsure about their own armies. Their armies, remember, had not been built up to strength. Secondly, again, the leaders of these countries were desperate to avoid fighting. They were still under the impression that maybe Hitler was only interested in the East. Maybe he would turn and start fighting Stalin and wouldn't attack them. It was this terrible fear because of what had happened in the First World War. But obviously Hitler did not stay in the East. He changed tact after he had conquered Poland, turned his armies, and in a tactic called Blitzkrieg, which means lightning war, he basically rolled over most Western European armies. Now, Blitzkrieg here is a very simple tactic. You get lots of planes, get lots of tanks, and you blow the shit out of everything in front of you, and you move really quickly. And basically, France and Britain had nothing to answer for this, and they basically rolled over without a fight. Cartoons even from the 1970s remembered this tactic as being something truly dreadful, and it was a massive humiliation for Western armies. The Netherlands, unfortunately, did not put up much of a fight either. All of the defences in the Netherlands had been designed, you can see them, the Vesting Amsterdam, for example, were designed to stop cavalry, horses, infantry. Didn't really have a lot to do with planes and tanks. And after the bombardment of Rotterdam in 1940, the government surrendered. So, France surrenders in June 1940 and Hitler goes to Paris. The humiliation, according to him, of the Treaty of Versailles is avenged. Now, Hitler doesn't actually conquer all of France. The north of France is under German control. The south of France, there is a new government called the Vichy regime. These people are collaborators and supporters of Hitler. Now, for one reason, it's because they didn't want to be massacred and killed by the German army. But it's also important to note that many people in Europe still had a lot of time for Hitler's ideas. They believed in a lot of what Hitler wanted. There were lots of willing collaborators. And this was just as true for the Netherlands as it was for France. Now, the next thing Hitler had to do was conquer Britain, but there was a little bit of sea in the way. In order for the Germans to conquer Britain, they needed to destroy Britain's air force. Fortunately, thanks to a new technology called radar, and also the help of Polish and other European pilots, Britain was able to defeat the Luftwaffe, which was the German army. The Germans then, because they couldn't basically invade Britain, turned to another strategy called the Blitz, which is the bombing of British cities. The British and the Americans were going to do the same for Germany later in the war. You can see here, this is the British underground, people sleeping here while London was bombed. And there's a rather famous propaganda poster here, "Keep calm and carry on." What do you think the aim of this was? So the aim, if you're now on the worksheet and have done your answer, was to give people the idea that they were going to win. In the meantime, rustig maar. We're going to win this. We're going to get on. But at this particular stage of the war, people weren't very helpful. It did look like Hitler was going to win. Things got worse, obviously, for everyone when Hitler then broke his treaty with Stalin, as everyone expected him to, and invaded Russia. This was something he'd talked about in Mein Kampf, his book, because he wanted Lebensraum, this huge empire in the East, which was going to supply resources, slaves, living space for the German people. In the East, meanwhile, the Japanese, and this is a whole nother front, attacked Pearl Harbor. This was a big American naval base in Hawaii. Japan wanted to be the supreme power in Asia. Now, they were allies, bondgenoten, with Germany, and the Japanese thought by destroying most of the American fleet, actually, they would then force America out of the war. So at this time, early 1940s, It was a dark, dark period. But Germany did then declare war on Japan, and Germany and America had remained neutral until then. Now, in the East, the war was just as terrible. In fact, in some ways, it was even more terrible. The Japanese had invaded China from 1937 to 1939 and quickly overrun much of the Japanese armies. This included huge numbers of atrocities such as the rape of Nanking, where about 300,000 people were said to have been killed in just a few weeks by the Japanese army. Western powers then agreed to start helping China, but up until 1942, 1943, the Japanese were pretty unstoppable. They were capturing European colonies all over Asia. At one point, they even bombed Australia. It looked like Japan at this point might very well end up being the big power in the Pacific. Now, some of you may be Marvel fans. You may have watched Captain America movies. Captain America comes from the Second World War. Now, you can see two of the original Captain America pictures here, which is Captain America punching Hitler in the face and punching the Japanese Emperor Hirohito in the face. Now, apart from obviously the fact that the Bucky of nowadays is immeasurably hotter than the Bucky of then, focus here on these pictures here. This gives this idea that this was a simple war. It was good, the Western democracies against evil, concentration camps, mass killings of civilians. So the question I suppose I'd like to ask you, was the Second World War one of these simple wars? Was it good, Captain America, versus the evil, Hitler and Japan? Have a think for a second. Well, no, obviously it's never that simple. In America, at the time, they still had a brutal system of racial segregation. In many US states, something called the Jim Crow laws made it illegal for blacks and whites to eat in the same restaurant, go to the same toilets, use the same facilities. After the war, there were massive battles in many US states for whether black people should be allowed equal rights to white people. The British had the biggest empire in the world. This was based on the idea that the British were racially superior and better than other people. In the middle of the Second World War in India, the British stopped food going to parts of India in order that that food went to Britain, so Britain could carry on fighting the war. This led to a huge, massive famine, Hungersnot, in which millions of people died. So while it was true that Hitler and the Japanese were terrible, Hitler and the Germans and the Japanese regime during the Second World War were pretty freaking terrible and did terrible things, it wasn't necessarily just good versus evil. Now, for the Dutch, obviously they had their empire in Indonesia when the Japanese captured this. Dutch prisoners, and this was really shocking, of course, white Dutch prisoners were kept in concentration camps there, which was a huge humiliation, obviously, for the Dutch, who would consider themselves to be part of the superior European race. Some women were even forced to work as prostitutes in these camps just to get by. But in 1942, it was a turning point. The Americans massively defeated the Japanese in a really important naval battle called the Battle of Midway. And from this point on, the Americans really had control of the Pacific. In North Africa, the Battle of El Alamein, this was what actually my grandfather fought in, the German armies were for the first time defeated. German armies were therefore forced backwards now by the British and Americans into Europe again. Meanwhile, Hitler and his invasion of Russia was going bad. You made that, surprise, surprise, Russia's really freaking cold. And the German army got bogged down trying to capture a city called Stalingrad. The Germans lost. They lost many, many thousands of troops. And from then on, the Red Army, Russia's army, started pushing them back into Europe. Have a look at this. What is the message of this cartoon? Well, this was from midpoint in the war, and it basically showed that Hitler's invasion of Russia was his big miscalculation. Russia was a huge country with a huge army. And basically, any invasion, this Hitler's idea of Lebensraum, was bound to fail, as the armies were going to get stuck when the winter got cold, and then they were going to what they would call awake the Russian beast. And this would lead to defeat, which it did. With the German army now in retreat in Russia, in retreat from North Africa and through Italy. The Allies could finally land in Europe again. And this was called D-Day, Decision Day. In Normandy and other parts of France, large numbers of troops from Britain, America, and Canada landed and started slowly pushing the Germans back. Now, this didn't mean this was the end of the war by far. Market Garden was a battle to try and liberate Holland by dropping thousands of troops around the bridges of Arnhem. But the German army at this point was still fighting back, and the Allies lost this particular battle and lost thousands and thousands of troops. But when the German army tried to counter-offensive by taking their army through the Ardennes to recapture Antwerp, they failed. So while the German army were still fighting and still thought they could win, this was basically the end. The Allies were starting to push the Germans back into Germany. 1945, in February, there was the Yalta Conference. Churchill, the leader of Britain, Roosevelt of America, and Stalin of the Soviet Union were now actually talking about what they were going to do in a post-war Europe. And in 1945, Hitler was captured. Hitler was defeated. The Russian army captured Berlin. There was heavy fighting still, but Hitler then shot himself rather than be captured. So he died. May 1945, Befreiung. Germany was finally liberated. This was obviously great news, but within Netherlands itself, it's never a simple story. People who supported the Nazis, NSB'ers, which was the Dutch Nazi party, but also Moffenmeiden. These were girls who were accused of having relationships with German officers. These people were taken through the streets, their heads were shaved, they were humiliated. These kinds of things happened in war, and it's a big open question. Who collaborated? Who worked with the Nazis? Who was simply doing something to survive? These are open questions still today. But on the 8th of May 1945, Germany finally surrendered, leading to the Potsdam Conference. Now, this was a very different conference. War was basically now over. Roosevelt had died. Churchill had actually lost the election in Britain, and there were new players who did not get on with each other. Without war to bind them together, Soviet totalitarian Russia and democratic America did not find a lot in common with each other. And this is going to sow the seeds for what we will later call the Cold War. In the East, meanwhile, after the US had defeated the Japanese Navy, they still need to defeat the Japanese army. A brutal series of what was called island hopping wars happened in the Pacific. The Japanese occupied different islands, and each island had to be retaken. Now, some Japanese soldiers actually stayed fighting until the 1970s. So it was very much this idea of we can never surrender. The US and Japanese suffer massive casualties. As the Japanese Air Force loses pilots, they start doing something called kamikaze attack. Poorly trained pilots basically were put into planes which were loaded with explosives, and these planes were then, there was a kind of suicide attack and self-mord anfall on American ships. In response, the US decided to try and bomb Japan out of the war. They did something called firebombing, which the British also did in German cities, where you drop so many bombs on a city that you create sort of like mini nuclear explosions. The air becomes so hot, it basically sucks and destroys everything around there. But Japan still wouldn't surrender. So, in 1945, the first and only time nuclear weapons were dropped on two Japanese cities, Hiroshima and on Nagasaki. The devastation of these was the thing which finally basically convinced the Japanese leadership that they had to surrender. However, a question for everyone. 200,000 people died with these bombs dropping on Japan. This is not, of course, to say that many hundreds of thousands also died with the firebombing attacks that they'd done before. But the question which a lot of people have, was this a war crime? Or was this, by dropping these bombs, they ended the war sooner and therefore saved many lives as a result of the fact that there would therefore be no fighting. So have a think about this. My last question for you. Nuclear weapons, mass bombing of civilian targets, a necessary tactic of war or a war crime? Let's have a look at the deaths. In terms of casualties, you can see here the Soviet Union lost the most people. As a percentage of their population, however, Poland, you can see, was by far the highest. Nearly 20% of everybody in Poland died, killed by the Soviets, killed by the Nazis. China also lost a massive number of people. Lithuania too, mainly because of attacks against the Jews. If you want to learn more about this, there is a fantastic film which I've got here called The Fallen of World War II. I strongly advise you to watch this. I will send you this lesson up, and you can then watch the film with the lesson up. There is also a movie here about what happened during the Holocaust. I'm going to make another quick movie about this, but I would very much suggest you have a look at that as well.